David, great to see you.
Good to
As
see you, Mark.
always, uh, folks, this is outside of our normal recording sessions. We have some exciting custom research. That's at least the term we're using at Mercatus internally to talk about this project, and it's something that really came to mind when hearing from retailers in the selling in the online channel and how they were adamant that they did not and will not alter their pricing strategy in order to emulate what they're doing in store. And so I posed that scenario to David, and David and I started discussing, is that actually a smart business move if you're looking at the online channel as a mode of selling, and then it sort of escalated from there into how would we assess this? How would we measure as to whether consumers actually sense if there's a differential between online and in store, and what role does the third party delivery marketplaces play in all this? So without getting into any further context setting, David, I just wanted to welcome you and say I'm excited to share some of the insights that have been gleaned from the research project that we've conducted together.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been a long time coming, and looking forward to seeing how retailers embrace it.
Yeah, so let's get into this. Now, you have often said that online pricing or pricing strategy in general is the third rail. Elaborate on that for me.
Well, first of all, Mark, you know well from the past work we've done with retailers that this isn't a new topic for us. However, we have continued to face some of the kind of objections or barriers, if you will, when discussing it with various regional retailers.
Yeah.
And, I think what comes out is that there is a belief uh, that we need to offer the same price online as in store. As to where the the knowledge comes from to validate that belief, that's the question. But I think most grocers don't question that. I mean, it's in essence an axiom, right? It's a self-evident truth that everyone accepts like gravity. But what we continue to see, with increasing amounts of evidence, is that the opposite is true, and that
Right.
is, shopping online from a mode of shop. We look at it a mode of shopping, is a convenience-oriented function. The primary benefit that the customer receives by shopping online, whether for delivery, ship to home, or even pickup, is saving time, right? And saving time is framed as the time it takes to drive to and from, as well as actually walk the physical store. That hasn't changed. That was the case before COVID, during
Right.
COVID, and now. We just have a lot more customers interested in using this mode of shopping, and it forces this conversation right back to the surface.
Yeah. 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 And it's just going back to the scenario that I opened with, and I'll be interested to see how this research is received, uh, both by our clients and then the general audience that will be watching and listening to this video. I'm always struck with this notion that retailers want to generate revenue through their online channel, and how do we get engagement and conversion, which makes perfect sense. But they're not really looking at, or if they are, they haven't expressed it. Whether that channel is a profitable one for them. They'll spend gobs of money to attract customers, but when it comes to retaining the most valuable ones that they have, doesn't seem to be as top of a priority. And I wonder why you think that might be.
Well, first, if we, look at when most of the retailers were entering, the online space relative to selling, that was triggered in large part by Amazon's acquisition of Whole
Mhm.
Foods. So, retailers reacted in a defensive way, for fear of losing the customer. So when you're, playing defense, protect the customer base or protect the base sales is really paramount. I mean, profitability takes a back seat to that, because without the customer, I mean,
Yeah.
you can't achieve profitability. And then, during
Yeah.
COVID, we had this massive surge of demand that really accelerated growth. And when growth is really strong, you're going to continue to press the accelerator to get more than your fair share. And in that scenario, profitability takes a back seat. Well, we don't have the growth that we used to have. And in fact, we don't have the growth, period,
It's
especially
softening.
in
Yeah.
grocery. And we're expecting this to be a down year in terms of the top line. And so when growth goes away or stalls, then you have to look at, how do you become more efficient? How do you deliver the same experience, goods and services, more economically? And the challenge that they're facing is, someone like Walmart is really kind of in the Goldilocks zone, given their scale and capabilities and what they're about ready to kind of transform into with, the emergence of retail media. Really just begs the question, well, how are we going to continue to compete when this inequality between the national and regional grocers is only going to expand?
Yeah. It's. I think it's a question that we hear all the time. Um, you have regionals that are looking at not just what their traditional competitors are doing, but the nationals like Kroger, like Walmart, who have access to what is commonly referred to as ancillary revenue streams to offset the cost to serve. It gives them more flexibility. But
Totally.
if you're a regional retailer who's looking at, how do I not lose my shirt in serving an online customer? Let me ask you: do you think some retailers are looking at online as a loss leader, like they do, maybe the some of the fresh departments in their stores?
All I can say is, if someone is viewing or perceiving the role of online as a loss leader, I haven't met that retailer or grocer yet or had
Mm-hmm.
that conversation. In that context, a loss leader would be a loss leader because it drives traffic, right? That's why certain products are known value items. It helps not only define our price image, but also helps drive foot traffic into our store. So you think about the online the same way. Um, then you say, well, if it is a loss leader and it's intended to drive traffic, and that's a justification for losing money, all we're doing is throwing good money after bad and building an unsustainable business. So at some point, we need to reconcile the top line with the bottom line, because as the contribution of online continues to grow, whatever rate you consider, that decision is going to, again, eventually bring you back to the question, how do we develop a more sustainable and sound
Yeah,
strategy that makes sense to us as a regional grocer?
which which is basically, don't emulate what the nationals are doing. Find, focus on what you are and your customers are doing, and what your customers want of you.
Yeah, and I know in the report that you'll be releasing, Mark, we
Mm.
provide a waterfall kind of analysis or waterfall chart analyzing the difference between how a regional grocer versus someone like Walmart can cover the direct labor costs
Yeah.
associated with fulfilling an online order for pickup, and we can see differences in their ability to drive efficiencies through assembling. That's the pick, pack, and stage functions. We can see the small reliance, almost non-existent reliance on service fees to offset that cost. And we can see a huge gap right now already that exists with their ability to use, as you put it, Mark, ancillary revenues in the form of retail media monies to offset this cost. And at the same time, because of the volume that they are moving through their outlets, they're actually increasing the distribution efficiency of a pickup order, which is simply, being able to batch out multiple orders to the transfer point when customers come to pick up those orders. So when you look at that and see the delta between what's remaining in terms of direct labor costs for a regional grocer versus Walmart, I would hope that a regional grocer's executive team would ask, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to improve that situation? And how do we view these other ancillary and related areas as a way to help offset the investment that we continue to make in this emerging area that we call online grocery shopping?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think part of the reason we wanted to do this to talk to an audience that we typically don't engage with, and that's the more financially minded within the executive suite. So I really think this is going to be an eye-opening, illuminating piece of research that we've done lately. Now, one of the key data points that you helped uncover was the perception that customers have of a delta between 3P, 1P, and in-store. Can you dig or offer a little more insight into what that perception is?
Yeah, I think from the retailer standpoint, there's this belief, especially when we're talking selling online using the first-party website or mobile app, that we need to have price parity between the price of the product in store and the price of those comparable products online. And so, one thing we want to understand is not whether customers believe it's important to offer that, because if we, framed it in such a way, most customers would not necessarily indicate they are willing to pay a higher price online. Yeah. But what we wanted to understand is, first of all, how well do customers perceive how retailers are pricing online versus in store? So in the work we just were doing, Mark, we identified by asking customers, who they primarily shopped with, who they shopped with online most recently, when they shopped online most recently, how did they place that order? Did they use the first party, mobile app or website, or did they use a third party, like a marketplace? And then we asked how they viewed or believed the prices online based on those criteria compared to in-store. And, while over half of those customers who used the first party indicated, oh, we believe the prices are the same online as in store, and some retailers would take that as evidence, see, customers know, what we actually found was when we compared that to what we know, because when someone said, I shopped online with Walmart using the Walmart, .com or mobile app, what we found was just over half actually were able to correctly respond with what the reality was relative to the pricing online versus in store. And that was true for Walmart as well. In other words, we had slightly more than 50% of the Walmart customers who said they most recently used them to buy their basket of groceries indicate that the price online was the same as in store. We had a lot of customers who conversely said it was either higher or lower, or some were just honest with us and had no clue. So what that tells us is, if so many don't have the correct perception, may simply be they haven't thought about it. And why haven't they thought about it? Well, that is because when I'm shopping online for groceries, for pickup or grocery delivery, it's because of the convenience that it affords me, not the cost that it can help me save. So, we take that as evidence to support that, pricing isn't as paramount to the customer as the retailer would think. And it's not to say we take advantage of that that gap or that ignorance, but rather recognize that there are other features that are more important to those customers when they're shopping online.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So David, I gotta ask this question because I know it's come up internal. So are we basically nuts recommending that on your 1P, the grocery retailers, increase their product pricing, especially at a time when there's been so much focus on higher grocery bills as a result of inflation? What would you say to this?
First of all, there's rarely a good time to have a conversation about raising prices. So understand the sensitivity to it. To say we're nuts would suggest that this is abnormal. And it may be abnormal in the sense there aren't a lot of retailers doing this today. So that could be a definition of abnormal. But, I think we look at it as progressive, which is, when you look at the facts, when you understand the customer and the purchasing decision and the buying behaviors, and you try to reconcile with how do we grow a profitable business that can sustain itself for decades, if not more, in perpetuity. We kind of forced this question, and as you know, Mark, in the part of the work, we did go in market and do an in-depth pricing analysis across 8 banners, and we did highlight at least 2 grocers that were already exercising essentially this type of framework within their own organization, different degrees. But I'd also add that, most retailers are looking at this from the in-store to online first party. And what I would say is reframing it from the customer standpoint, which is if they're shopping online, they could be shopping on the first party site, or they can be shopping on the third party marketplace. And when you think about the prices that they pay on the marketplace, could be 10% to 17% higher in some cases for the retailers we looked at, then adding a slight markup, which could be anywhere from 3 to 9%, depending on the retailers we looked at, in relation to the third party, they're still spending less. Now, obviously, when they make the change, the customer will spend more online versus in store. But frankly, we're talking 2 different modes of shopping that have 2 different cost structures. And, we're not talking about classes of trade like mass and grocery. We're not talking retail channels, because retail channels is really a retailer centric view that looks at, direct and indirect, online, catalog, in store. From the customer standpoint, we're looking at the mode of shopping, in store or online. And when we look at online, the buying behaviors are quite different. So we would look at this as a necessary evil, as a way to provide a value added service for those customers who appreciate utilizing that service. We can see in the market, there's evidence that this is an effective, I would say yet to say proven, but an effective approach for providing sustainable service in a way that makes sense for a regional grocer. Now, the grocers are going to argue, well, we're not that retailer, we don't have 80 share, or we're not that retailer, we're not the discounter. But beneath that, or behind that, the question still lingers, well, what's the option? What's the alternative?
Exactly.
And we don't hear a lot of alternatives. So part of this framework was to learn from what we've done together, Brick Meets Click and Mercatus, over the last few years, trying to help retailers understand the opportunity, and realizing what was missing from that was the framework, which was a process by which you could step through these decisions and utilize strategy to make choices that made sense to your business and to your customer based on your competitive position. So I'm hoping that now the framework will at least accelerate the adoption for those who believe they have the opportunity and the will and the conviction to see this path forward.
So there you go, folks. We're not nuts. Thanks, David. I really appreciate that answer. Now, David, you've produced a framework that is going to help the regional grocers walk through this. Can you provide a little more detail?
Sure. So when we look at this framework, there's essentially 3 stages. So let me just walk through those 3 stages briefly. Stage 1 is establish the baseline. We're looking at quantifying what is currently the direct labor cost associated with fulfilling an online order for pickup, and any other relevant costs associated with that for that matter. We want to factor in, what is our current or forecasted sales level looking like for the next 3 to 5 years. And then we also need to have the conversation, what is the role and impact that retail media monies can play in offsetting some of this investment. We see other grocers and retailers doing that. So that's stage one. Stage two is really kind of modeling the enhancements of this new pricing framework, which is, how do we improve the distribution of orders in terms of how they're fulfilled by using a tiered fee structure. We talked about the mechanics of that. We can then project how that new fee structure will help lower the unit cost to assemble the order, because now we are being able to more effectively leverage that advanced, pick pack practice to drive greater efficiencies through batching out more orders together. We then need to think about what is the upper band for that fee structure, and we really start with looking at that from how do we fulfill that single order and still cover its cost. And then we look at, when all said and done, what is remaining in terms of the direct labor costs, again, only direct labor costs, and what is the potential markup that we would want to use or consider using to cover that remaining cost. In the third stage is really determining those details, which is, understanding the messaging and positioning and how we're going to communicate this to our customers. We're going to look at other areas of sensitivity relative to pricing, like considering how to price protect an advertised item or a known value item for that matter. And then we're also going to try to reconcile the role that our first-party website and mobile app play in relation to other third-party marketplaces, because after all, there are some opportunities to drive further efficiency if we can build the volume on the first party. So those three stages walk the grocers through a framework that will help them arrive at what are the best decisions for them based on those respective inputs.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it's powerful in its simplicity, and yet it's also quite broad in the recommendations that come out of this framework. So really well done.
And I would also add, it should encourage, I don't want to say force, but encourage the retail teams to break down those silos, because we're going to have issues that operations want to have an input on, to marketing. For instance, we bring up in the report, while we would always suggest that you offer even pickup with a fee, there may be an opportunity for some retailers to consider whether they take the low band of their cost structure and offer that as a free option. And again, without going into the details, the reason that's important is then it could create some synergies with marketing as a way to promote your service, knowing that these explicit fees are also considered avoidable fees. And if we can find ways to encourage behaviors that benefit us, we can reward those behaviors by helping the customer save money. And that's a win-win that we think this outcome has.
Awesome. Absolutely. David, can't thank you enough for providing the analysis that you have. I think the audience, retailers, are really going to have derive a lot of value out of this report, and I know it's going to generate a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So again, thank you, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Always appreciate it, Mark.